Now available on Kickstarter, John Haynes at Death's Door. The man who rules the world takes on the Greek god of death in this all-new Kickstarter exclusive John Haynes comic book. Put in your pledge and get the standard, variant, or retro covers of John Haynes at Death's Door and other great stretch goal rewards on Kickstarter today. Before I go into today's comic video, I want to give everybody an update on the John Haynes at Death's Door Kickstarter. Now, currently, the John Haynes at Death's Door Kickstarter is fully funded, and we are past the first stretch goal, which is a beautiful print by artist J.C. Shun. Now, we're working towards the second stretch goal, and at the second stretch goal, when we pass $1,600, everyone who put in a pledge for a paper copy will receive a John Haynes sticker. So right now we are at $1,255 and about $395 away from breaking the second stretch goal. And that second stretch goal, again, will be a sticker. So everybody put in your pledges and you'll be able to help us break the second stretch goal. And once we break that second stretch goal, everybody who ordered a paper copy is going to get a John Haynes sticker. So if you want to put in a pledge for the John Haynes at Death's Door Kickstarter and pick up the first full John Haynes comic, you can do so by clicking the link in the description box, and you can get your copy of John Haynes at Death's Door. Now, with that perfunctory out of the way, I'm going to get into this viewer-requested video. Now, one of my viewers wanted me to talk about how a comic can practically fall apart once the original creative team leaves. And this is something I've seen throughout my 30 years of comic collecting, seeing many great books do well with the initial creative team, and then once that creative team leaves and a new creative team comes on, what happens is that book goes into a serious decline. I've seen this happen back in the 90s when one of my favorite books, Iron Man, was being written by Len Kamenetsky and drawn by Kevin Hopgood and Tom Morgan, and they did an exceptional job of making Iron Man practically an A-list character during the early 90s. And the book was on the brink of becoming one of Marvel's top books until your Len Kamenetsky and Kevin Hopgood were taken off the book, and they were replaced by another writer who just couldn't cut the mustard on the book, and the art just fell completely apart. Now, before this serious drop in quality on Iron Man, I remember growing up as a little kid and seeing the precipitous collapse of Alpha Flight. Now, Alpha Flight was a book that one of my family members really enjoyed, and I thought it was a top quality book when it came out in the early 80s. Alpha Flight showed a lot of promise at Marvel, just like Iron Man did in the 90s, and with a legend like John Byrne doing the writing and the art on Alpha Flight, the book was performing practically decently every month, and Marvel's first premier Canadian super team was generating pretty solid sales. However, your John Byrne in 1985 was getting burnt out on Alpha Flight, and he was looking at better prospects across Manhattan over at DC Comics. So in mid-1985, your John Byrne practically wanted to hang up the pencil on Alpha Flight, and he wanted to stop writing Alpha Flight, and he had practically finished everything he wanted to do at Marvel on Marvel's Fantastic Four. So your John Byrne basically had lost his passion for Alpha Flight. He had just was getting ready to wrap up his run on Marvel's Fantastic Four, and he was on his way to starting Man of Steel for DC Comics. So with him working on 2 books of 2 flagship characters, he wanted to move on past Alpha Flight. And unfortunately, as your John Byrne was getting ready to stop working on Alpha Flight, Marvel also lost the editor who was working on Alpha Flight as well. Now, the late Denny O'Neil, when he came over to Marvel Comics, was coming off the legendary Batman run he had with the late Neil Adams, and he had settled into an editorial role where he was working on books like Iron Man and Alpha Flight. But your Denny O'Neil at the time was ready to move on as well, so both John Byrne and Denny O'Neil left Alpha Flight, and after they left Alpha Flight, the quality on the book went into a serious decline. Now, if you look at this splash page, it shows you several of the greatest writers and editors in comic history. You have John Byrne, you have Keith Williams doing the inking assist, and you have Denny O'Neil as the editor and Jim Shooter as the editor-in-chief. And with all of these individuals in charge, you got really high quality on a mid-tier book like Alpha Flight, because if you look at the visuals here and the art, the shots right here are extremely cinematic. I mean, this splash page is extremely strong. You see all of the characters looking bold and dynamic, and the action practically pops off the page. And that's because John Byrne had a high level of quality in his approach to comics, and his style of storytelling was rock solid when it came down to comics. Now, your John Byrne, again, even on a mid-tier book like Alpha Flight, where he really wasn't that enthusiastic about it, still put a lot of effort into the quality of the artwork that he put a lot of quality into his stories, and you really got a rich, multi-dimensional presentation of the characters when he went out here and put a story together. Because, again, we look at this opening sequence, you have a strong splash page of Gamma Flight on the run with your Delphine Courtney in the Guardian outfit, and this builds into them running away, and then you see this suspense building with this car being mutated by Madison Jeffries, and you get some great facial expressions, and you get a great setup in less than 3 pages. Byrne shows us how he is a master craftsman with this sequence, and basically gets us into the action in less than 3 pages. So your John Byrne shows that he has great skill at storytelling, great skill at shots, great skill at action. And again, this isn't just in the first 3 pages of the book, and this was his final book on the run, but this final book on the run ended on an exclamation point that really got the reader compelled to pick up the next issue. Unfortunately, when they picked up that next issue, it wasn't as high quality, and it wasn't as high quality because editorial really didn't have anybody there to really pick up this book and really make it work. So this final book, again, by John Byrne and Denny O'Neil, really showed how they just really knew what they were doing. Unfortunately, the person that they got to replace them, they just were not a good fit for the book, and that's where the book ran into serious problems. This book ran into serious problems. Okay, let me pick this up because that's issue 30. This is issue 29. What they did was they thought they could go out here and get one of their veterans, Bill Mantlo, to fill in for John Byrne. Unfortunately, Bill Mantlo was not a good fit on the Alpha Flight book, and the Alpha Flight book went into a free fall in terms of quality because they wound up losing one of the best editors in the business, Denny O'Neil, the legendary writer of the greatest Batman, one of the great Batman runs in history, and they also lost John Byrne, one of the great storytellers. And Bill Mantlo, while he was a very good fill-in writer for many books over at Marvel, he just wasn't a good fit for Alpha Flight, and Alpha Flight just fell completely apart in this 29th issue. I mean, this 29th issue is a complete disaster of a book, and if you look at the shots here, they just feel very uninspired, even though they're done by veterans. like Mike Mignola, the art just doesn't have that pop. The art just doesn't have that energy, and it just feels really uninspired, and it just feels like the story just doesn't really come together. I mean, John Byrne sets up this huge exclamation point. Unfortunately, Bill Mantlo winds up following up the exclamation point not with another exclamation point, but he follows it up with a period, and it's this period that made a lot of people put a period at the end of their Alpha Flight collections, because the Bill Mantlo run on Alpha Flight was absolutely horrible. You hear a lot of people complaining about SJW comic books today, but your Bill Mantlo's Alpha Flight was right on the level of many of those SJW comics back in 1985 through about 1992. And even Bill Mantlo himself comes out here and says that this was the worst run he ever did in his career, and he regrets the damage he did to the team of Alpha Flight with his writing. I mean, he has come out on record and said that his work on Alpha Flight was absolutely terrible, and I've also heard artists like John Camilleri also come out and say that the work that he did on Alpha Flight was absolutely terrible as well, and he actually destroyed many of his own pages of art because he was absolutely disgusted with them. But this whole decline in quality as related to the Alpha Flight comic is primarily because what happened was the legendary Jim Shooter and many others didn't really have a vision for the book, and they just kept the book in print because the book was generating pretty decent sales. So Alpha Flight was one of those books that John Byrne had lost his enthusiasm for. He had said even in the comic he only wanted to do 12 issues, but because the sales were good, he continued to do the book. And by issue 28, he had burnt out, and he had already seen, okay, he is wrapping up his run on Fantastic Four, getting ready to do his run on Superman, and he just decided to walk away from the book because the book really, he had no real enthusiasm for it, because in his own words, he said the book was two-dimensional and absolutely flat. But the whole thing was that nobody was there to really have a vision for this book, and they just gave it to Bill Mantlo just to keep the book in print, and that's why we got this really uninspired flat art, these really bland visuals, and the character development, it just turned into one big meandering soap opera, and the book really never recovered from the damage that was done when John Byrne and Denny O'Neil left the book. And because John Byrne and Denny O'Neil left the book, there was nobody there with that vision for the book like they did have for other titles in the 80s. I mean, books like your Iron Man, which was struggling, recovered when David Michelinie and Bob Layton took it back over. Mark Gruenwald breathed brand new life into Captain America, and Walt Simonson breathed brand new life into Thor. And your Peter David revitalized the Incredible Hulk with the help of Todd McFarlane, and your Spider-Man was also brought back was continuing a hot streak from David Michelinie. All these books were doing well at Marvel. Unfortunately, Alpha Flight was not able to build any of the momentum that it started when the book first started out and John Byrne was in charge of it. What happened was Alpha Flight, after John Byrne left, just fell completely apart because there was no visionary there to really give this book the kind of stories that would really make it pop. Yes, Jim Lee did a couple of issues when Alpha Flight came out in the early 50s. I have a couple of those, and he was just a test artist for the book. But then once Jim Lee started to build some sales, they moved him over to X-Men, and sadly it just showed how little care was put into Canada's team of premier superheroes. They were just treated like second-tier characters, and sadly that's due to the fact that editorial really didn't know what to do with them. editorial really didn't have a vision for them, and they let the book fall into precipitous decline. But books fall into precipitous declines like this because creative and editorial don't have anything for them to do, and what they do is they'll keep the book in print because it's making them money, so they'll let the book coast on autopilot, and that's what Marvel has done with Alpha Flight ever since about the 28th issue in 1985, and the book really never got to build its momentum up to become a top-tier book, and that's sadly what happens when you don't have a good creative team with a passion, a vision, or a heart for the book. The book falls into a precipitous decline, and some readers will stay with the book, but most will walk away from the book, and the book will just fall completely apart creatively. And Alpha Flight is a textbook example of what happens when a book falls apart creatively. You get bad writing, you get meandering soap opera style stories, and even the Incredible Hulk brought into the book can't really save the book from the lack of vision and lack of direction. I remember my sister buying this book, and she was disappointed in it, and I was disappointed in it too, because when we go and we look at issue 28 and we compare it to issue 29, there's a real serious drop in the quality of Alpha Flight. I mean, we go from big, bold, dynamic visuals, to these really uninspired, flat, bland visuals, and it's a major league disappointment as related to Alpha Flight, which was, again, one of Marvel's premier books on the mid-list that could have been on the rise, but it wound up declining because of a switch in creative teams and going from the legendary John Byrne to a lower-tier team with no real direction. That's something that can really just make it where people go from buying a book monthly to never wanting to pick this book up again. And again, when you have creators like John Byrne, Bill Mantlo, and guys like John Camilleri saying that this was their worst work, that really shows you how the book's quality really declined. And again, you have guys who were disappointed with Alpha Flight because they know they could do better. And the sad part is that they really didn't have a passion to do better because Marvel was just publishing the book because it was making sales. So it's just a disappointment all around as related to Alpha Flight. But this book is a textbook example of what happens when you go from an editorial team and a creative team that has passion and heart for the book to those who are just there going through the motions. So you'll have a lot of people saying, oh, these SJW Marvel books are so bad. But even in the golden age of Marvel in the 80s, you had books like Alpha Flight, which were struggling, and they were struggling because there was no real vision for the book, no real direction for the book. And what happened was a book like Alpha Flight went from absolutely fantastic art and creativity by John Byrne to falling through the cracks of Marvel's publishing catalog. Now, my comic, John Haynes at Death's Door, is available on Kickstarter, and if you want to pick up your copy, you can put in a pledge by clicking the link in the description box. And if you want to learn more about John Haynes' story, you can pick up the John Haynes books on Amazon.com, including The Temptation of John Haynes, The Man Who Rules the World, John Haynes, A Conversation with Death, John Haynes, Dark Succubus, John Haynes, The Man with Nothing to Lose, and John Haynes, Taking Care of Business. You can pick up all of these books on Amazon.com, or you can get all of those books plus the John Haynes at Death's Door comic and a variant cover in one of the premium tiers on the John Haynes at Death's Door Kickstarter. And if you want to see me do another comic analysis video like the one I just did right now, you can donate to my Patreon, my PayPal, or my Cash App by clicking to the link in the description box. And if I know something about that comic, I will make that video for you. That's all I have to say for this video. You can comment, rate, and subscribe. Now available in paperback and e-readers, E-Steam Horror of the Hyena Woman. Hell's aspiring angel takes on a wicked werewolf in this action-packed all-new E-Steam series adventure. Get E-Steam Horror of the Hyena Woman in paperback and e-readers today.